So for those of you signing on, welcome. We're just gonna wait in the lobby, I guess, for a couple of minutes. Gary's here with me. We're just making some small talk. We'll start right at around 10 o'clock, maybe just a couple of minutes after 10:01, 10:02 or so. Give everyone a chance to log in and get their technology settled. I'm coming from the remote offices of Tech San Diego and Rancho Penasquitos. How about you, Gary? Where are your remote offices?
I am up here in Orange County in Yorba Linda, beautiful Yorba Linda, California.
Well, that's good. Hoping the weather. It's been cold here the past couple of days. Hoping we get a little bit of change here.
It's windy up here today. I don't know how it is down your way.
You know, I haven't paid a lot of attention to it, but I wonder what kind of snow is up on the hills.
I see it up in the hills. I don't know how much is up there though.
Yeah, I haven't been paying a lot of attention. I know they haven't got a lot of a lot of moisture this season, so hopefully it'll be some snowpack up there. Somebody was telling me that whether we're in a drought or not, it doesn't the snowpack makes a difference, but what really makes a big difference is a slow melt, right? So if it all goes away overnight, like that's no good. It all runs off. But if it's a slow melt, that makes a big difference in whether we're in a drought or not. So we'll see. Hopefully, we'll have a mild spring and we'll see that slow melt.
This weekend's supposed to be beautiful. It's supposed to be close to 80 degrees.
Yeah, I'll be traveling. I'll be traveling up north to visit family. So that'll be interesting. It'll be my first road trip. I bought a Tesla, and it'll be my first road trip in the Tesla. So that should be interesting.
Can you make it in one drive without recharging?
Nope.
Mm-hmm.
About a 300-mile range, so we'll be stopping probably 2 or 3 times. I don't know. I haven't taken it on I've only furthest I've drove is around 20 miles, so we'll see what happens.
So you have a good map of all the charging stations?
Oh yeah, the map in a Tesla, when you program your destination, it'll show you, and they're superchargers, so you can fill up in anywhere from 15 to 30 minutes, but
That's
it shows you where all the supercharger stations are. And going up north, I mean, there's hundreds of them. I mean, it's the most in the U.S. So I don't think we're going to be caught.
Do you pay for the supercharger? Do you pay for the superchargers?
Yeah, you do. Now, when you buy a new one, I got a referral code, so I got 1,000 free miles, and then if somebody uses that code, I get 1,000 more. I may have some friends that may get them, but you do pay. I think it would have paid. I think I used a supercharger twice, and it was around $8 or so.
Oh, reasonable.
Yeah. Certainly better than gas.
Correct.
And I see gas is starting to go up.
It's almost $4 a gallon. Well, I use premium, but it's just about $4 a gallon now.
And you figure in California, it's always
a little higher.
My brother's in Texas, and they're giving it away.
I'm not sure after this winter though.
Yeah, that's true. Those of you who are signing in, we're waiting for just a couple minutes after 10 to officially get started. We're just making some small talk with Gary. I see Tiffany from CMTC. Hello, Tiffany. Tiffany's muted, or we can't hear her.
She's just getting started, I bet.
She said she's having trouble with the audio. Sarah, that's your cue.
Tiffany, it says that you're not connected to audio. So I need you to go into option, go into file, and then preferences, and then the bottom audio, and select a device to be your output and input.
We use the GoToWebinar platform, which tends to work very well with us. We've had very little issues, and it's very secure and very private, and people can't just jump on who we don't know. So it's worked out fairly well for us.
Mm-hmm.
We do definitely notice that people have a little bit of Zoom fatigue.
Correct. From using Zoom or just using any kind of webinar or presentation?
You know what? I don't know if it's using Zoom. I think it's more, what I'm hearing is it's more on the event side, right?
Okay.
So, and it's not, you can say, well, maybe our content isn't good on our events, but I talked to other organizations and they're having some of the same challenges. People will do Zoom meetings, but I think for events and stuff, they're getting a little fatigued.
Mm-hmm.
So I should say Zoom event fatigue.
Right.
Tiffany, did you get your audio straightened out?
Yeah, we're having the same issue with CMTC, Kevin.
Yeah.
Our webinar attendance is way down, way down.
Yeah, we had 18 registered for this, and typically we would have between, 30 and 60. So we definitely feel it as well.
They probably knew my background. That's why it's down.
All right, for those of you signing on, we're going to get started here just a second. We're going to see if we get our CMTC connector, Tiffany, on, and then we'll get started. Tiffany, you can always just use the call-in number too. I don't know, Sarah, if you have that, you could share with Tiffany.
Yeah, I'm working with her. She can't hear us.
It looks like she's on chat, so she could definitely see some things. But we're not going to hold up for that. And when Tiffany comes back, we may take a small break to make sure she introduces herself. But let's go ahead and try to get started here. My name is Kevin Carroll. I'm Executive Director of Tech San Diego. Welcome to the Manufacturing Operations Roundtable. We've been doing this since the inception of Tech San Diego. And in fact, its genesis go back to several different organizations, and we've inherited this series and kept it, and very proud to keep it. And manufacturing is a very important part of Tech San Diego, and we're proud to have a very strong affiliation with CMTC that goes back again. They were a founding member of Tech San Diego, and they have sponsored this series. For those of you who don't know CMTC, when Tiffany gets her audio, we'll make sure that she gets a little chance to kind of introduce CMTC. I've worked with them extensively. They are a federally kind of federally chartered organization that's set up to help manufacturers. They have a lot of services, many of which, in fact, most of which are either subsidized or free. So those of you that are manufacturers, if you haven't at least had a talk with CMTC, you're probably doing something wrong. And so either after this or during this, we'll make sure that Tiffany's email is available to everyone. And we'll go ahead and make sure to keep on letting you know what's going on in CMTC land. With that, I'm going to introduce Gary Steinberg. Gary did a podcast with us a couple of weeks ago on Made in America, which was very instructive, and most of that dealt with supply chain. And it was so intriguing, I invited Gary to address this group, really talking about some of the disruptions. And my senior operations roundtable, we're also having challenges with supply chain disruption. So we thought there would be no one better to bring on and talk about this. I'm not a big believer in reading off big bios. I'm going to let Gary introduce himself, and he'll tell you what he thinks what's important in his bio. And with that, I am going to go off screen. There is a questions you could ask. There's a little box that should allow you to ask questions. Most of those I tend to hold until Gary is over. If it's really compelling, I'll kind of use my executive director's discretion to interrupt, but we will get to your questions. So as soon as Gary's over, it's a short presentation. We'll go immediately Q&A, and I definitely expect you guys to ask some questions. So with no further delay, I'm going to turn it over to Gary Steinberg, Supply Chain Advisor, CMTC. Gary, before you get going to your presentation, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you, Kevin. Thanks for having me present today. Great opportunity to share my knowledge and my information that I have with everyone on the webinar today. To give you a quick bio of my background, 40 years plus in supply chain, probably around 30 of those years with Fortune 500 companies, some of which you know very well. I'll start off by just throwing out Apple Computer, Hewlett Packard, uh, Becton Dickinson, just to name a few. And my roles have been everything from director of supply chain to general manager, but primarily my background, my education's all been in manufacturing engineering as well as an MBA, and so finance, engineering, and ultimately most of my experience and my years in industry have all been in supply chain. My last 10 years or so, I've been predominantly in the consulting area, with a couple of years out back in industry. And I've consulted a lot in supply chain, and a lot of those roles have been in the supply management and planning roles. So with that, that's really pretty much my background, and I'm happy to present today on a very, very key topic that we're all familiar with, especially within the last 12 months, which is a new term, somewhat of a new terminology that we all know about, but it never really became highlighted until the pandemic, and that is supply chain disruption. And a main factor in that obviously was COVID. COVID hit the global, platform, the universe really, and it all started in Asia, predominantly Europe, and as well as the United States. So with that, I'm going to get into a lot of discussion around the pandemic, general causes of supply chain disruption, but I'm going to go into a lot of detail of what are the risk factors, what are the challenges that we see, and I'm going to ultimately end with discussing some of the tools that we can use to uncover, if you will, some of the risks that exist within the supply chain, and ultimately just talk quickly about a call to action. So with that, I'm going to go into our first slide today, and that is what's been the COVID impact on supply chain? What have we seen? And what I can tell you is that disruption because of COVID has been severe, and it's really caused management and business leaders to take real quick action. We're talking about this about last March and April timeframe. So again, it was a real scramble to really work on and figure out how do we service really our customers. That's ultimately where we are. Plus, in addition, how do we protect our workers in the workplace? So those are the two key areas that I think were really important 1 year ago. And thanks to Accenture, they also have done a survey. This was back in the March and April timeframe last year, that we can see here from the numbers. This is a huge impact. I mean, we saw during the pandemic, that 94% of Fortune 1000 companies were seeing supply chain disruptions. And of that, 75% of the companies had negative or were negatively, strongly impacted by the pandemic. And then the other impact was more in the long term and all the business outlook, that 55% of the companies said they actually downgraded their growth plans. So, severe impact because of COVID. So with that, let's just go to the next slide, and we can talk a little bit about, what I call, these are top of mind. These are the general causes in terms of supply chain disruptions. So first of all, the pandemic. The pandemic caused, full factory shutdowns across the entire globe, starting in Asia, United States, and Europe for an extended period of time. So again, once we have that break in supply chain, everything's interrelated, so it caused a dramatic disruption to the supply chain. We always have natural disasters throughout the world. And the one that's always in front of us, that all of us that are in the supply chain, is this reliance on a single supplier, single sources, and especially on key parts. And then what we're experiencing even today, and Kevin and I discussed this before going into this presentation, was what we're seeing extended delays in customs and shipping on a lot of these overseas shipments. And for those of you who live close to Los Angeles, if you go down to, Long Beach or any Newport Beach, and you just look out there, and you can see anywhere from 15 to 20 general tankers out there, trying to offload their cargo. You're seeing that those ship containers are being delayed anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks right now. And we hope that that situation will improve, but I think we're going to be seeing that situation for the next, I'd say, 3 to 6 months until we try to level out on all these delays we're seeing in shipping. We're also seeing delays due to what I call base materials, raw materials shortages in the supply chain. For example, steel, aluminum, petrochemicals, a lot of those raw materials are now coming from Asia. So we're seeing a lot of shortages in those areas. Commodities, that's another area we're seeing a lot of disruption. And for me, in my role here at CMTC, I've been requested to look for a lot of packaging. So a lot of packaging like spray bottles, plastic bottles, food bottles, trigger sprayers have all been impacted by our supply chain disruption. And a lot of that is because a lot of these bottles have been used for cleaners, hand sanitizers, a number of those items. And there's been a worldwide shortage for the last year. And if you went to place an order today, a lot of times the feedback is, that's great, but you may not receive your product for 6 months. So those lead times have definitely been extended. And then, of course, a simple one is that because of demand on certain items, certain key parts, we're seeing a lot of suppliers run at over capacity. So those are some of the general causes. Let's get down and we'll go to the next slide. In the next slide, I'm really going to talk a little bit more in detail. So we're looking at, if we look at the far left-hand side of this, I'm not trying to read this, word by word, but I want to go through some of these key points. The left-hand side, that column there is talk about factors in disruption. And then we look at 3 things. We look at the supplier side, we look at us internal, which is we, the company, and then the last critical part is the customer. So we've talked a little bit about disruptions. So I think the key here is that if you go back and just think through what supply chain is, supply chain has a lot of different disciplines. It goes from the planning phase to the procurement phase to the operations or manufacturing, all the way through to distributional logistics. What's important to remember is every aspect within the supply chain is interrelated. There's an interdependency on each of those disciplines. And the other important factor, it's a closed loop system. So, what happens at the beginning of the supply chain, also impacts the end of the supply chain. So you start with your supplier, who's the start of the supply chain, and you end with your customer. And usually the end result with the customer drives your entire supply chain. So whatever changes, whatever improvements, whatever disruptions that you're experiencing your supply chain impacts your customers. So your customers really drive your supply chain strategy. But let's go into some of the factors that we're seeing here through disruptions. So the first one, if we see a shutdown, a factory shutdown for an extended period of time, that obviously impacts the supplier. So that's obviously going to impact you as a company, as the company that ordered the part. You're not going to get your parts on time, and then obviously that impacts your customer. So, these decreases or disruptions have a certain impact right along the supply chain. And the next factor is delays. Pretty obvious, if you see a delay in receiving parts, and in this case by a month or more, your production and your production orders are going to get delayed by 30 days or a month. And then ultimately your customer deliveries are going to get delayed by 30 days. So you can see the interrelationship in all these areas. And that's, again, that's a key component of supply chain. It's just a lot of moving parts that are synced all together. Systems, if the supplier has a system issue, that's going to affect your system and your procurement, your supplier management side. And then again, that's going to impact your customer and how your customer orders their parts. So again, there's that impact. I'll go down and jump down into the procurement section. And this is, the first one is on returns. We see delays in returns because, again, one of the, what I say, hidden disciplines in supply chain is your reverse logistics or your returns aspect. A lot of times when we discuss supply chain, we always think about returns as an afterthought, but that is a critical component in the supply chain as well. And then, of course, with procurement, we see price increases, we see transportation increases, and that has certainly has an impact on profitability and your cost of goods sold. And then, of course, ultimately that could result in a customer price increase. So ultimately, these are the factors, and here are some of your, what I would call your key impact to your suppliers, your company, and your customers. Let's go on to the next slide. So again, as we get into what are the challenges that we see in front of us? Okay, well, COVID certainly was not a typical event, but it really heightened our reality around supply chain disruption. And we see that in times that companies really needed to respond quickly and confidently, and to really figure out a very short-term tactical plan to mitigate the risks, to both their workers, human health, and also, protect their global supply chains. And we saw it certainly in this past year, that global supply chains are not typically resilient, and they do break down. And we see this especially in a global environment. So, again, something that we're challenged with. And we also see, because of this whole disruption, what we're seeing and what we're experiencing due to lack of capacity, due to the unavailability or lack of availability of base materials, that we're seeing a lot of cost price increases across the supply chain. And ultimately, as we know, supply chains often represent a company's highest costs within the company. So, costs of A good sold is typically a very, very high cost factor in a company, and certainly has a direct impact on our P&Ls. If we can go to the next slide, please. So again, there are more challenges that we see. You know, impacts to the supply chain and not being able to meet our stakeholders' expectations. So, you know, who are the stakeholders? Well, the stakeholders are either the executive team or your shareholders or whoever is the owner of the company. So, you know, that is a key disruption for sustainability. We're seeing obviously talent gaps again around the supply chain. And again, supply chains depend a lot on human interface, our workforces, not only to drive and manage the supply chain, but actually, you know, produce the products within the supply chain. So talent is a key aspect within the supply chain. And one that's always we're focused on is flexibility. Do we actually have the flexibility to address our customer demands? And over the years, the last challenge is our systems, IT systems, to continue to run. Are they flexible? Can they be depended upon? And can they be dependent upon in times of, you know, supply chain disruption? So, you know, IT systems, basically, when I think of supply chain, one of the key supply chain tools that drive supply chain is a tool called SIOP, ERP, MRP, just to name a few of them. So SIOP is Sales Inventory Operations Planning, which really sits on top of what we call our MRP or Material Requirements Planning. And for those of us who are in what I would call sophisticated supply chain, you really can't operate with the number of SKUs, with the number of products, without having an effective MRP, ERP, and SIOP process in order to really have an effective supply chain. So your dependency on IT and IT being dependable is a very key challenge that we're faced with. So, and it's become more and more important to supply chains. Next slide, please. So again, we're going to continue on our risks and looking at risks and what I call drivers. And we've talked a lot about disruption, so I don't think we have to spend a lot of time here, but certainly things like, you know, we look at supply. One of the things we didn't really talk about is even bankruptcies of our suppliers. Are our suppliers, you know, stable? Again, single sourcing. We're talking about capacity and actually responsiveness within having alternate suppliers. We talked about delays. You know, the one we hit on quite a bit was on transportation delays. We can talk about poor quality, flexibility within our suppliers, capacity utilization. So, you know, when I think about supply chain, I think about how complex it really is. There's just so many factors within a supply chain. And when we really sit down and think about all the factors, we really have a lot to manage within the supply chain. And next we can go to forecast. You know, how accurate is our forecast, especially around long lead time items. We have product life cycles to think about when we talk about forecasting. Our customer base, you know, one-time events, sales promotions. We have artificial demands that drive our forecast. So all of these are risk drivers. These are all, you know, dependencies, if you will, into all these risk categories. And then we have procurement. Procurement is, you know, what do we have a high percentage of our key components with one source? do we have industry-wide capacity shortages? And one that we're commonly hearing today is semiconductors. You know, it's having a huge impact on the auto industry, and the auto industry has had to idle several of their manufacturing plants because obviously cars today are dependent on being smart and using a lot of semiconductors. So they're seeing quite a big disruption within their supply chain due to the lack of semiconductors, which is a worldwide shortage today. We have contracts in procurement, short-term, long-term contracts, and obviously the last one would be exchange rates. And exchange rates, I think the risk there is really more of a cost driver. You know, we know that exchange rates, you know, change dramatically when there's dramatic fluctuations in exchange rate. It drives pricing, which obviously at the end drives our P&Ls. So next slide, please. So now we have a few more risk items. Let's just go through a couple of them. Inventory is a real risk driver in supply chain. One of them is product obsolescence, holding costs, and product value. So again, not even in terms of pandemic or disruptions or whatever, inventory is a key driver when we get into forecasting. Our friend, like my friendly CFO would always walk into my office and say, hey, we have way too much inventory. What can we do to drive our inventory down? So that's usually a continual improvement we work on in supply chain is how can we be flexible, nimble, and how can we reduce our inventory to a level that we can still be able to satisfy our supply chain requirement, but yet keep our inventory at the lowest levels possible. Capacity is always an issue. You know, what's the cost of the capacity? What's the cost of being flexible with capacity? And out looking at your supply chain, how flexible are your suppliers in meeting your demands and fluctuations that you have in demands. Receivables, basically that drives financial strength of customers and has another impact in terms of your payment terms and again, cost of goods. If we can now go to the next slide, what I like to do now is change focus and like talk a little bit more of, now that we've talked about all these risks, all these challenges, what are some of the tools that we can use to mitigate risks in our supply chain? So I have a couple of examples. I mean, these are certainly just a couple of many that you can use, but one that's very, very valuable is what I call a mapping tool. Now, a mapping tool is very complex. So this is one approach that takes quite a bit of time, and it also takes time and a lot of cooperation from your suppliers to help with mapping out your supply chain. So if we start with what I call our top five in terms of revenue drivers in your company, we take this approach, what we call a drill down on your bill of material. We look at our tier one suppliers. We look at all these, you know, what I call key component suppliers, raw material suppliers. And what you would typically do is you really drill down and almost like, I'm going to use this, like, developing a process flow chart is really just going, tier by tier, step by step within each supplier, within each key supplier, and just going all the way down as far as you can go to the base of material to really, what I would say would be uncovering those risks within each of your components, within each of your suppliers, and your key top 5 products. So you're uncovering those risks so that therefore, once you uncover those risks, what are the steps you can take to mitigate those risks? So, but this is a complex exercise. Again, it takes a lot of cooperation from your suppliers to participate in this exercise. And once you do this, it may actually take some software and some tools to really develop this mapping. But it's an excellent tool. It takes, I would say, quite a bit of investment in time, maybe 2 or 3 months to go through this exercise. And I think what's important, and I think I can share a personal experience, when I was working for an OEM manufacturer, we were producing mice or mouse or whatever input devices, as we call them, for Apple and Microsoft. So on a trip that I made to Asia, I realized that, well, not only do we make the key part, our company made the key part for the mouse, which is called an encoder, but I realized it had a little shaft and it had a little, wheel on it. Well, when I looked around, I realized, well, these parts aren't being assembled here on site. Where are these possibly being made? So, because I was, the director of supply chain, and they decided, well, I guess we can't keep this secret anymore. So they said, do you want to see where we actually assemble these parts? And I said, yeah, absolutely. So I end up getting driven to a small house that has a small garage in the back, and there probably were 20 to 30 workers in that garage actually assembling these encoder wheels. And it was like, wow, this is a revelation. So that's an example of how far, and this is only really like the second or third tier in this supply chain part, when you go down and drill down into this part and the bill of material. But it's really, was revelation to me that, wow, you really have to really uncover your supply chain. It's quite, it's quite shocking, to say the least. So I wanted to take that personal experience and just share that today. So that's one of the reasons that using a mapping tool is a very important and critical part in really assessing the risks within the supply chain. May I have the next slide, please? This next slide, and it's a busy chart, so I apologize for that. But this is intended, I'm sharing this. This is something I kind of used from the supply chain media organization. But this is a self-assessment tool. So this one itself is it's an easier tool to utilize. And this again goes through some of the things we've discussed today. It really gets involved in looking at a strategic view within your supply chain, more of your tactical, and then your operational. So, you can pick the different categories that you would like to assess. But if you go up here, it goes across the 3 important disciplines in the supply chain. The first are your suppliers. The second is internal, which is you, the company. And then last is your channels, which really means customers. So in this particular example, you're assessing those 3 phases, and you're going down into each of the factors, and you're really doing a scoring on each of these factors. So, on your strategic, you're looking at things like risk, supplier risk management, sorry, a product compliance, if you will. And then you get into the tactical, like cost opportunities, production planning, capacity, so on and so forth. And then within the company, they cross over in when, for example, supplier capacity planning with your supplier. How does that work within your own company? And like I talked a little bit about SIOP, this is sales and operations planning. So doing these assessments, you basically come out with a scoring factor, and then based on those scoring factors, you can see where you have risks within your supply chain, where you feel you're very competent, where you're excellent, and then obviously, you go down to the lowest level and you work on those risk factors, and again, work on those plans to improve those risk factors. So I think it's a good tool. It's a good tool to use, and like I said, you can use a tool like this that you can, find anywhere out there, and within on the internet through different organizations, or you can develop your own tool. But a self-assessment is a key tool to assess your supply chain. Can we go to the next slide, please? One back, please. Thank you. So what are some of the outcomes you can expect? These are some of the outcomes that are pretty typical, and I think that can be anticipated within your supply chain when you do your self-assessment, or you do something like a drill down and you get into mapping. But first of all, how do you increase capacity in your supply chain? So these strategies that we are going to discuss, there's a basic theme. So the basic theme, if you have a more commoditized product that has a very predictable demand, you're basically going to go after lowest cost or your highest capacity with less flexibility. So keep in mind, that's the general theme we're going to talk about in going through some of these strategies. And again, I'll go through some, not all of these, but just some of these. So increasing capacity, you start to centralize capacity for unpredictable demand, but you increase decentralization as cost of capacity increases. So therefore, you're taking more risks, when you have more commodity type products, or again, when you have more decentralization. Redundant suppliers, again, you utilize redundant suppliers for high volume parts, less redundancy for lower volume parts. So again, it's the risk reward, again, looking at risks versus more risk versus less risk, let's just say. Responsiveness. You prioritize cost over responsiveness for commodity products, but you prioritize responsiveness over cost for short life cycle products. Inventory. Talked a little bit about inventory before. Decentralized inventory of predictable, again, predictable lower value parts, but then you centralize inventory on less predictable high valued parts. Increase flexibility, prioritize cost over flexibility for predictable high volume costs. So you can just see the basic theme here. Prioritize flexibility, low volume with uneven demand. And quickly just getting into increased capability, prefer capability over cost for high value, high risk parts. And then prioritize cost over capability for low volume commodities. So again, this theme just carries through when we talk about the focus areas and strategies to mitigate in these focus areas. May I have the next slide, please? This is our quick call to action. So now that we've looked at all of our challenges, we've assessed our risks in our supply chain, we've talked a little bit on what we expect as some of the risk mitigation activities. Our next step is, well, how do we implement, all these recommendations, these, if you will, risk mitigations. So it's what I call a call to action. And this is just simply starting. You mobilize, we look at mobilizing, we establish the rules, responsibilities, and quite important aspect is we basically create a team to mobilize. And that team, I would recommend, consists of everybody from the sales organization to supply chain management to planning, obviously operations, and if we can get executive management as part of the team, it could be very critical. And then the next step is sensing, or what I call prioritizing, where we saw the risk factors and what those risk factors, what impact they potentially have to your supply chain, and identifying those. And then once we analyze, and we can analyze those, we can create what if scenarios to source the products, plan, and distribute those products. And then we do the next step is we actually go and configure, and we go to the implementation phase, and we execute to those plans. And we do that as we all are usually fairly conservative in the supply chain. I would recommend you do this in a phased approach, one part at a time, one commodity at a time, and then you measure. You definitely, like everything we do in the supply chain, we always measure. We always have our, KPIs, our scorecards, and we always want to measure any kind of new plan, new implementation, and what impact that has, not only to our supply chain, but most definitely to our customers. So with that, I'm going to end my presentation, and I'd love to take questions, and I thank everybody for their time this morning.
We have lots of questions, Gary, as you can imagine. So we have such a small group today. This is the first time I've done this. I am going to, and Sarah, correct me if I'm doing this wrong, I am going to unmute our attendees so they will have the ability to jump on and ask a question. I know I have a couple of questions. While I'm unmuting everyone and trying this, because I've never done it before, Tiffany, can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
We can.
Okay, great. You can or you can't?
We can.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. I'm Tiffany Garcia. I'm the local client advisor for the San Diego and Imperial Valley region. For those of you who are just getting introduced to CMTC for the first time, we're a nonprofit and part of NIST at the federal level. And within NIST, there's a manufacturing extension partnership. So we're across the United States. There's one MEP in every state, including Puerto Rico, and so CMTC is the MEP for the state of California. We're a trusted resource for the manufacturing industry, and as advisors, our roles are to provide solutions that impact and grow this sector. One of the ways that we do that is through utilizations of consultants across the state that are either in the industry or have been in the industry, like Gary. So thank you, Gary, for your supply chain expertise. We provide resources and solutions that are no cost or low cost. So if you have any business needs where you need to train your existing workforce or bring in new workforce, you want to look at ERP selections, you need quality certifications, or you need just some basic HR help, those are the kind of resources that we can provide your business. So I look forward to, I'm going to link up with everyone who is in the presentation on LinkedIn. That's a good place for me to share my resources across
Tiffany,
the county.
what's your email address, Tiffany?
It's tgarcia@cmtc.com.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Gary, I have a lot of questions. So one of the first ones is, you talk about these disruptions, right? And I have executives that are literally going on Google and, type XR525. What are some trusted sources that we can go to for on the supply chain? Are there, or is there such a thing as trusted sources? What's a good source that you've used in the past or that you recommend?
Well, the first source I use, of course, as Tiffany mentioned, CMTC has a lot of clients within our database. So that's my first, source. But I think the recommendation for me and what I've utilized quite a bit, I've used 3 different industry sources. One is pretty well known as ThomasNet, which we probably all know. The second one would be IndustryNet. And the third one, a little less known, is Connex, C-O-N-N-E-X. And it's called Connex Marketplace. And that's actually a database that's funded by the MEP in some of our states. So that's a little bit of an infomercial, if you will. But primarily ThomasNet and IndustryNet are pretty good sources for locating suppliers.
The second question I have, and Sarah, in the background, I tried to unmute all. Can our attendees unmute themselves if they have questions? Do you know?
I have unmuted all attendees. They have the option of unmuting themselves.
All right. Okay. So if they'll ask a question, they can. The other question I have, Gary, is that, in some ways, right, we got rid of our distributors, right? And a lot of us went directly to the source. We went online, and now you're seeing the return of the distributor, or maybe the revenge of the distributors, right? We've had to dig out our Rolodexes and call our distributors, and what they're telling us is not good, right? They're saying, okay, you got to sign a long-term contract with me. You were buying 10 parts of XY a month, you're going to have to, at least buy, 60 to 80. How much risk are we going to have to take in holding this excess inventory versus the hope that 3-6 months down the line that things do flatten out, things come back, the ships in the LA port get sorted out, and some of this gets sorted out because we're making these decisions in real time about whether to sign these long-term contracts, rather to re-engage with distributors. What's your guidance on, and again, some of these distributors are really making some unrealistic demands on how much inventory you hold and other things. And, I think a lot of companies don't know how much to engage with that or whether to.
Okay. I'm going to give you my personal recommendation here, because I think, again, I'm going to draw on my background and my experience. When I started out, I was really, truly an engineer. But, during my experience and over the years, I've become to realize that supply chain is dictated by your customer. Okay. So as much as we want to reduce our costs on our supply chain, always going to the lowest cost if we can, I always, in the end, what's important is meeting our customer requirements. And I always say, Kevin, I'd love to save a lot of money here, and I'd love not to be able to or have to sign these long-term contracts. But in face of disruption, in face of not meeting my customers' requirements, I am going to do whatever it takes to get that part. And I don't care if I pay 2x or 3x, but what I've learned through my years in industry is you have to keep your customer. You must keep them happy. So at least for the short term, I am going to overpay for that part to keep my customers satisfied.
Yeah,
And that's
I was
just
hoping
my,
you'd say everything's going to be back to normal in 2 weeks, and you shouldn't overpay on parts and everything else. You know, the other, I had a hunch that you would give guidance in that direction. You know, the other challenge is, you know, the supply chain costs are dramatically increasing, right? And yet, it's very challenging for customers to accept hike increases in the end products. What are some of how are some of your clients handling that? Because you know our costs are going up, and yet when when we put our new catalog out and we try to put a 10% increase, all of a sudden, our customers are balking a little bit. How are your clients handling that issue?
it's a risk reward situation, Kevin. I think everyone's being faced with price increases. And again, as I mentioned earlier, what in my experience, what I've seen is companies that have very robust supply chains and can deliver their products on time end up being the the customers will always come back to you, even if there are price increases, because it's that dependency, that reliability that you can offer. So I think it's important to understand that there's it's a risk reward thing. I mean, we're all going to be faced with price increases, but I think the more robust we can all create in our supply chain and the ability to deliver product, I think that's going to be the overriding factor more so than price increases, because that's just a fact. That's just a fact because even like I said earlier, raw materials are increasing. So along the way, everyone's going to be impacted. And finally, yes, certainly the customers are going to see price increases as well.
You know, it really is a dramatic a shift from what, if you look at the past 10 years, and I look back a lot of the topics for the manufacturing roundtable, and it was, eliminating costs from your supply chain. It was how to manage just-in-time inventory. So all these lessons that we learn kind of growing up the past decade have kind of, we've had to shift that a little bit, and it's really jarring, I think, for a lot of companies. Are you seeing any, in order to maintain some buy, we've also heard that big buyers are also taking up a lot of supply. I think I use the auto industry as an example of some of the chip shortages that companies are facing, and people are blaming the auto industry. I don't know if that's the right word. But are there co-ops or are companies banding together to have additional buying power? Have you seen any of that, or are there other strategies that companies might employ to move themselves up the line a little bit in a priority on distributors?
I haven't seen that much in terms of suppliers, but I have seen consortiums when we get into transportation logistics and a little bit in the commodity side, where we do have buying consortiums or buying, if you will, I can't really, it's sort of, yeah, it's sort of like, like an agency, if you will, where we get a group of companies and buying a product with one demand, and then, so that does occur, but it does occur a lot more with transportation, moving and logistics and that type of thing. But I think a lot of the proliferation in terms of buying components and materials and parts does go back to the distributor model. For example, if you can't locate a part at one distributor, it's sort of like, go out there and find other distributors. So I think you can use and leverage your distributors in the same like consortium type of model, in kind of grouping together in a group of companies. So I think, Kevin, that's where you can really leverage your distributors, this distributor model, because they can act like your inventory for you, because they're the ones that are holding your inventory. And that's primarily why you pay a premium when you buy product from a distributor, because they're the ones that have to take the risk on holding that inventory on your behalf.
Yeah, and it just seems like they're not as willing to hold as much inventory as they used to. And I think that's just a supply and demand issue. So let me ask you the same question on the trusted sources. So is there a list of trusted distributors? So I think that's, by the way, very good advice that if you're not getting the right answers from your current distributors on your Rolodex, go to other distributors. So where's a good source for distributors?
One thing I didn't mention earlier, which I think is important, is, go to your industry organizations. Go to, if you're in the molding industry, go to your plastics organizations, go to your molding organizations, and look in their trade magazines. They usually have lists of distributors. So I always rely on those organizations because those organizations, I trust when those distributors are listed in those organizational, magazines, if you will, or online, or, they're there for a reason because they're trusted. They're a known commodity, if you will. No pun intended, but they can be relied on to provide competitive pricing, and they have inventory typically, and they again, I think, and they have reasonable lead times. So that would be another source for you to locate trusted distributors.
You talked about the friendly CFOs, which is probably I haven't heard that phrase together in one sentence. But I'm going to put you on the spot here. So your CFO knocks on your door and they're saying, okay, boards asked for a forecast going into next year of the increase in our supplies and our raw parts or whatever that is. If you were on the spot to give kind of an overall across industries amount that that's going to increase on parts, what would that be? Would it be 5%, 10%, 20%? I know it varies based on what you're doing, but if you were to give a guess, overall high-tech manufacturing, and you were really put on the spot, what would you say the amount of increase we might be looking at over the next 12 to 18 months?
Oh boy, that's a tough one to answer because it's hard to predict. But I would say overall, I'd say probably about 25% would be about the right amount. Yeah.
Wow.
To insulate against these disruptions and the risks in supply chain. But again, you can do this in a way that you can, I think, intelligently look at, again, risks. Again, Kevin, kind of using like that, what I call the mapping tool, kind of map out your critical parts first. And that's where I would say the critical parts, your tier one, that's where you really need to increase your, custom parts, tier one parts, critical parts. That's where you really need to mitigate your risks in inventory. Your component parts,
Tiffany
you can go to
Garcia, are you still on?
Yes, I'm here.
Tiffany, can you help us get that mapping tool from Gary, and we'll go ahead and put that on our website? So if there's some tools that we can use that Gary's talked about, we will put that. We have a whole page on manufacturing on our website, so we'll make those available. Do we have any other questions? I know we have some not bashful folks on there. I see Craig Hagan and Griffin, and I saw Martin from the Senior Operations Group. Any other questions before we let Gary go on and do his supply chain wizardry?
Actually, yeah, I had a quick one. Good to talk to you again, Gary.
Nice talking to you.
Yeah. So I just want just a kind of a brief, quick go over of your decentralized versus centralized inventory. So we have lots of, a couple high ticket items, right, that make up 75% of the cost of one of our systems of the COGS, and then the remainder 25% is just commodity stuff. And so those high ticket items, luckily we have pretty flexible suppliers. But on the low ticket items, I just kind of wanted you to re-clarify what we should be investing in, or what would be smart to invest in.
So you're talking about your commodities?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Now commodities, are they coming out of distribution or direct from suppliers? Just to kind of.
Both, to be honest. Yep.
I think, for your commodities, you can definitely, that's a risk reward thing. I think you can put more risk on your commodities versus your high value parts. And I think you can generally leverage your distribution network more so, obviously, than your high dollar or your real key components, your key parts. Yeah. So I'd be less concerned about commodities versus your tier one parts.
Okay. All right. I appreciate it.
All right. We have a couple people asking about if this is going to be recorded. Yes, it is going to be recorded, and so everything will be here. So we are going to we'll go ahead and end this since we don't have any more questions. Gary, it was a great overview and great little Q&A session. Look, there's a lot of challenges. We're probably going to have you back at some point to talk about that, but I want to thank you for your time. And again, I want to thank CMTC for everything they're doing for the manufacturing community. And if Tiffany's not on your Rolodex, she should be. So if you're going through some of these supply chain issues, Tiffany's gave you her email address, tgarcia@cmtc.com. Give her an email and see if they can help you out. I know a lot of our members have already used them and pretty happy. So with that, Sarah, let's go ahead and end this. Did we lose? Sarah Spiva is our events manager, and she's the voice that I sometimes hear in the ether if we do something wrong. Sarah, are we okay to end the session?
Thank you so much for to everybody who took time out of their day to join us. And this event will be up on Tech San Diego's YouTube channel later this afternoon.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Gary.
Thank you, Kevin.